Good morning. Good morning. My name is Catherine Bush. Welcome to Calvary Episcopal Church on this Sunday morning. Those of you who are here in person in the Great Hall, those of you who are joining us online, it's good to be together for this time of conversation and learning. This is week 2 with Courtney Pace, who I'm just going to go ahead and say she's a friend because I feel like we're kind of kindred spirits, and even though I just met her for the first time this morning. So many of you may have heard from her wisdom and insight last Sunday as she began to tell us the story of Prathia Hall, and she's back this week to kind of help us connect the dots to that story and today and to our lives and where we are. She is just abundantly educated. Her list of degrees and all the things is so good, but I want to particularly highlight that if you want more of this story, that there is a book that she has written called Freedom Faith, The Womanist Vision of Prathia Hall, Beyond Eden, the collected sermons and essays of Prathia Hall. So those are available, and there's ways to go find that book and to read more and to do a deeper dive and a deeper study. But mostly we're just glad that you're here for part 2 of this conversation, so thanks very much.
It is so good to be back with you today. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm happy to do a quick refresher. But what I'd like to do is spend most of our time talking about Freedom Faith and its implications for us now. I imagine we all came into this room hearts heavy laden with particular issues that are tender to us. And we gather together week after week hoping that our faith will guide us to our next step and maybe even answers. So I can't promise that today, but I can promise community in which to reflect and a journey back to the things that have been most important in guiding the decisions of our lives. Prathia Hall was a leader in the civil rights movement in Southwest Georgia, Selma, and Atlanta. Because she was from the North and had strong Southern family ties, she was excellent at helping SNCC volunteers understand the cultural conditions in which they'd be working. She and other SNCC field workers would go door to door in rural counties trying to get Black people to register to vote. They would help the people meet their work quotas so they could go to mass meetings in the evening. She frequently spoke at mass meetings and was known for mesmerizing the people with her powerful oration and wisdom beyond her years. She was the first Black person to sue for police brutality in the state of Georgia, though an all-white male jury acquitted the deputy in less than 20 minutes. Slide. In the summer of 1962, 4 churches in Southwest Georgia were burned within a month, and 2 within the same night. At a prayer vigil for Mount Olive Baptist Church in Sasser, Georgia, Hall used the phrase, "I have a dream," repeatedly in her prayer. And King, who was also there, asked her if he could start using the phrase in his own speeches, which he did by November of 1962. They had learned nonviolent direct action in Philadelphia through Fellowship House and were mentored in the movement by many of the same people. They deeply respected one another and often spoke together all over the country, raising awareness of and funds to support the movement. King referred to Hall as the one platform speaker I prefer not to follow. By 1963, Hall was leading SNCC's work in Selma, and by 1964, she was leading the multi-organization civil rights campaign in Atlanta. She was among those tending to the wounded after the Bloody Selma March in 1965 and was so traumatized by SCLC's insistence that the crowd not show any anger that she ended up leaving the movement, going back to Philadelphia, and trying to figure out what was next. She married her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Ralph Wynn, so you may often hear of her as Prathia Wynn or Prathia Hall Wynn, moved to Roosevelt, New York, and had 2 children. There, she became heavily involved in local activism, particularly related to education and job empowerment. Though she joined the movement in large part to avoid her call, by the mid-1970s, she could no longer silence it. She enrolled at Princeton Theological Seminary, and by 1977, she was ordained. She pastored Mount Sharon Baptist Church, her father's church, in North Philadelphia while living in Roosevelt, New York. I don't know how familiar you are with the Northeast, but those aren't close. And also commuted to New Jersey for seminary every week. Her husband was not supportive of her call, and his attempts to control her escalated to severe physical abuse, resulting in multiple hospitalizations. She filed for divorce in the mid-1980s, but never publicly discussed the abuse because she was afraid her call to ministry would be questioned if she acknowledged she had been abused. The weight of this burden compounded after a serious car accident caused a debilitating back injury that would incapacitate her for days at a time. Imagine a back injury and a commute and being a single mom. In the mid-1990s, she joined the faculty/administration, many of us have to work hybrid roles to get a job, of United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. So now she's teaching full-time, dean of chapel, trying to finish a dissertation, and a single parent with a weekly multi-state commute. You might not be surprised that she faced significant obstacles at United. The academy is not a hospitable place for Black women, and it was worse back then. So she took a lot of speech engagements to supplement her income, further challenging constraints on her time, in particular, getting her dissertation finished. She defended in 1997, and a year later, she was the visiting womanist professor at ITC in Atlanta. The following year, she was named to the Martin Luther King Chair of Ethics at Boston University School of Theology. This was the professional achievement to which she had been working for her whole life. In her first year, she was diagnosed with aplastic anemia and died in 2002, survived by her mother Ruby, her son Du Bois, and her grandson Michael. The central idea of her theology was freedom faith, that God wanted all people to be free and would equip and sustain those who worked for the liberation of the oppressed. Freedom faith means trusting God to take you down to the courthouse to register to vote and trusting God to bring you back home safely. Before Alice Walker gave us the language of womanist, and before Kimberly Crenshaw gave us language for intersectionality, Hall was preaching and teaching those very ideas. That by centering the experiences of Black women, we can better understand the biblical text and the world around us and the complex interconnections between various experiences of oppression. She named the pathology of oppression by which those subject to oppression were so internally conditioned that they began to oppress and dehumanize themselves, such that oppression became automatic. And Gerda Lerner taught us when something is ubiquitous, it becomes invisible. Because it's everywhere, we can't see it anymore. She described the bondage doctrine latent within churches, in which even those claiming to celebrate liberation, even those with progressive flags hanging on the side of the building, had created internal hierarchies, accepted complicity with sexism, heterosexism, ableism, racism, and Hall said these are incompatible with the gospel. Churches have to be about the work of removing these chains, exposing and dismantling any forms of oppression, even and especially within themselves, to have any integrity as the church. She stayed Baptist on purpose. I know, looking from the outside in, probably you have some questions when Baptists are on the news, and I imagine the first one is, why? I share those questions, but she chose to stay within the institution to call out the sexism of Black churches from inside, knowing her message probably wouldn't be received, but assured that she was fulfilling her calling in the exact context in which God had called her. Here's where I think her Baptist activism, that's a phrase, presents something very helpful for our wondering today about what freedom faith means for us now. Her work is only 20 years ended, but it feels like a civilization's worth of pain has happened since then. Baptists have historically insisted upon individual freedom and responsibility for our actions, and this is rooted in the Baptist belief that we have to give an answer for our lives when we die. So our choices have to be our own. And anything which denies someone basic human freedoms then interferes with their ability to make their own choices. Anything that comes between an individual and their ability to relate directly to God, which Hall would call bondage doctrine and its practices, is therefore anti-gospel. The work of the church becomes uprooting these chains so that people can respond to God freely. So we're going to talk a little bit about the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state is to protect individuals' right to practice their faith uncoerced by the government and to protect the government from being hijacked by a religion. The term religious liberty gets thrown around and people make it mean whatever they want it to mean, but historically and constitutionally, it means keeping church and state out of each other's business. Where people of faith, I think, get stuck is we try to figure out how to navigate our beliefs, our activism, and our citizenship. This relationship is at the center of church's ministry to families, to understanding human identity, and as Hall would say, if we are to equip our families and our young people in particular to face the challenges of the struggle for the survival and liberation of our people. William Hull agreed in his statement that we must use every means at our disposal to protest any infringement on basic human rights. Such engagement with the text is at the foundation of Protestant identity, is it not? Read the text for yourself. Affirm full and direct access of every individual to God and the ability and responsibility of all of us to interpret the text for ourselves, free from bondage to traditions and culture. Hall let the biblical text guide her understanding of Christian orthopraxy in her context, even as she drew upon Black Baptist heritage. She modeled that correlation between faith in the text and faith in a living God who continues to reveal new meanings of the text to believers in their time. In other words, the Bible becomes dynamic, not static. She drew upon the biblical text to reform a church caught in bondage doctrine without filtering her exegesis through the lens of church status quo or what would keep people comfortable or what matched the official theology of her denomination. Instead, embracing freedom faith to call out any form of oppression wheresoever you find it, confident that God was at work in that proclamation. Yes, she affirmed the separation of church and state, but she insisted Christians have the freedom and, yes, the responsibility to speak with prophetic witness in activism and advocacy. Protestants have been a little bit subversive. We caused quite the kerfuffle in the 15 and 1600s. Just as we have historically been subversive for freedom's sake, the future must unashamedly be subversive for freedom's sake. Let me put on my church historian hat for just a minute. Protestants, broadly speaking, I know there are many stripes of us, and we did different things at different times for slightly different reasons. We agree on almost everything except communion. That's where we really feel strongly about the way we see it. But broadly speaking, Protestants separated from the Catholic Church based on the belief that everyone should have unmediated access to God and that no creed or person or institution should come between a person and their God. We could talk all day about polity and hermeneutics, but it all comes down to removing that mediator. So the same thing that makes us Protestant, advocacy for individual freedom, should also make us anti-racist, should also make us anti-sexist, should also make us anti-heterosexist, because when we participate in the cultural oppression of others, we are placing one race or one notion of gender as a mediator between another individual and their God. It's just not up to us. We've lost our spiritual integrity if we tell someone how God wants them to live outside of their own knowing of who God has made them to be. Our freedom is as tender as the freedom of Black Lives to Matter. Our freedom is as fragile as that of love to win. Our freedom is as fragile as that of the right to choose. Let's think about what religious liberty means for us. The church can't legislate its beliefs, and the state can't favor one religion over another. The First Amendment doesn't say anything about keeping contemporary issues out of church. In fact, if you read the New Testament, most of what they were talking about at church was contemporary issues. Affirming the separation of church and state doesn't mean ignoring the world around you while you read the Bible, and especially not while you pray. It doesn't mean treading lightly to avoid offending people. It means keeping the institutions separate from each other so that the church can't use the state and the state can't use the church. But we care about a lot of the same things. In its DNA, authentic Christian orthopraxy is public advocacy. Even think about the languages we see in the text. Jesus looked at the man. They walked together. Someone opened their home. Someone made extra bread. That's advocacy. It doesn't always have to look like marches. We all play a different instrument in the band. The point is that you picked up your horn and you played. We recognize the commonality between every struggle for freedom and our own. And if you feel distant from elements of oppression you know others are facing, that's your privilege that you're feeling. Because you are just a few chess moves away from being where any of us could be. We are all humans made in the image of God living in the world. And our circumstances have a lot to do with the realities we face, for better or worse. These aren't political issues at their core. These are moral issues that are being argued in the political sphere because churches often resort to navel-gazing instead of looking around. It's not our business how people vote, but it is our business that everyone gets the opportunity to vote and that every vote counts. It's not our business who people love or the number of children they have, but it is our business that everyone gets to make those choices for themselves. It's not our business to advocate for budget allocations or city zoning. These are actual political issues. But it is our business and our identity as Christians to stand in the gap for every single person because they are made in the image of God, and they aren't free until they can live and breathe and move and thrive and decide for themselves, unmediated by humans or the structures they make, even the ones we make because we think it's what God wants us to do. Seeing the separation of church and state as ecclesial abstinence from world issues is a form of privilege, of opting out of the struggle because we can. Christian orthopraxy is rooted in the exact opposite, that there's no distinction between someone else's freedom and our own. That my freedom is bound up in yours and yours and mine, and if systemic oppression is anti-gospel, then the only way to live the gospel, to be the New Testament church, is to advocate for freedom. Hall understood that we need the church because God is actively at work liberating those who are oppressed, and God has called the church to partner in this work. To put it mathematically, the church isn't a single point on a graph, nor is it a vertical line of personal growth, but rather a three-dimensional sphere expanding in every direction, driven by love for God and love for each other. And this work is taking place beyond the church, often because that's where it has to go to have a hearing. I'm going to invoke Bell Hooks here. She writes, "I'm often struck by the dangerous narcissism fostered by the spiritual rhetoric that pays so much attention to individual self-improvement and so little to the practice of love within the context of community. If your Lenten practice is a self-improvement plan emptied of care and provision for the vulnerable, it is right to question it. We don't get free alone." God promised from the beginning of God's relationship with humanity to dwell with us, to tabernacle among us, to be present with us as we eat the bread and drink the wine on our tables. And because we feel God's presence when we practice togetherness with each other. Even God is relationship. Yes, the church is broken, but it still produced all of us. Here we all are, tuned in, caring, curious. Even a crooked tree can bear fruit, good fruit, and you all look real fruity to me. This is one place of many where we need Hall, where she has much to teach us if we will but listen. God called the church to mediate the struggles of its people for freedom and justice, and that is the work to do. Mediate the struggles of the people for freedom and justice. But this isn't the end of the church. It just means God works through those who live by freedom faith, even and sometimes especially outside of the walls of the church. Church doesn't stop just because we fail, and we have. We have all done something well-meaning that caused the opposite of what we hoped it would do. Aristotle says we learn morality by practicing. And life is a big practice trying to get it right. Church doesn't stop just because we fail. God doesn't stop just because we forget who we're supposed to be as the church sometimes. Thanks be to God. It doesn't depend on us because we're not the divine. We're in partnership with the divine. Some of us know in our bones that real church doesn't have to have anything to do with an institution. The real liturgy, which means the real work of the people, can happen anywhere. And sometimes real communion demands real talk at a real table set with real spirits. I love that I'm in an Episcopal church and I can say that. Baptists do it, they just don't talk about it. To those of you who have been hurt by the church, who don't see a place for yourself within it anymore, I can't know exactly what you feel, but I can share that I'm a fellow traveler on that road. I have walked away and come back so many times, and to some extent I'm still deciding. But I have met some of the most wonderful people in churches. People who have breathed life into me, who have recognized when I'm not okay and dared to ask me how they can help. People who have embodied hope when it seems crazy. People who care and love authentically, who say, call me if you need help, and when you call, they answer the phone. You may know full well what doors you've needed to close, but you may not know what open doors await you. To those of you within the church, I beg of you to remember the work to which you were called. It was to open doors, not to close them. It was to set bountiful tables and keep adding chairs. It was to proclaim the message of freedom and liberation, the gospel of Christ, and to be about the work of ushering in the kingdom here and now. It was to mediate the struggles of the people, not add to them. Not blame the people for their struggles, and certainly not to help the government criminalize the people for their struggles. You were called to love and liberate. Remember and repent, which is the true meaning of Sabbath. See Deuteronomy 5. Let's get our house in order and get back to that work to which we were called. Hall's freedom faith, that God meant all people to be free and empowers those who work for liberation, is prophetic womanist declaration that personal salvation and social justice are two sides of the same coin, those twin strivings of being the New Testament church. What a witness it would be for us to embrace our heritage as advocates for freedom. My hope is that now we can enter into a time of careful conversation with each other, naming the things that weigh on our hearts, naming the chains that still bind us, and evoking freedom faith to discover ways to remove those chains. So I want to hear from you when you think of the struggles impacting the people. What are those from where you're sitting? Housing. What are the struggles? Mental illness. I appreciate your energy. Thank you. It's probably more complicated than that, but people exist in every party, and people who mean well create a lot of problems for other folks, right? So we want to create opportunities for people to have economic mobility and access to health care and quality education. Those are all good and wonderful things. And some folks think, well, the way to do it is to make the on-ramp really easy. And some folks think the way to do it is to have the on-ramp build the strength for people to keep progressing. And we all want the same thing, but we get so caught up in fighting each other over the best way to do it that there are people just stuck in that crossfire who still don't have what they need. And then a lot of times our efforts to offer those possibilities have a pretty steamy side of condescension served next to the plate. Like, isn't it wonderful that I've come to help you today? Instead of, you're a person made in the image of God. What can I learn from you? How can we learn together? How can I really hear you in ways that are transformative for both of us? Some of that is, Historically, America has had this really inflated idea of its global purpose in God's work. I like to think God could use any of us for anything at any time. America's record suggests it might not be in the top 5 globally, but again, it's people, right? We're all people trying to do the best we can with what we know at the time. And so I don't say that to say don't try, because that's the worst thing we could do. It would be better to try and mess up than not try. But we have to always be learning and seeing the impact of things from other people's perspectives. And I think that's one thing that I love about Memphis is that we partner together with so many different groups. Churches work with nonprofits, work with government agencies, and all of us are confident we have the solution, but all of us have a slice. And we need each other to come up with something that's actually going to work, something that's going to meet the needs. And probably these problems are a lot bigger than any one program or one initiative can solve. But I know this is going to sound naive. The only place I've seen real transformation happen is person to person, one-on-one, treating one another with love. That's where real change happens. You might be surprised to know I grew up fundamentalist. I used to bring my Bible to science class to argue with my teacher. She loved me. And it wasn't until I dealt with my own call that I realized, wait, I'm sexist, and that's a problem. And then I got into this work and realized, wait, I've been racist. That's a problem. And then I realized, wait, that's connected to heterosexism, and I've been homophobic, and that's a problem. But those moments wouldn't have happened without exposure, without vulnerability, without humility. And even in the way that we offer benevolence and care to one another, I hope we'll bring that same curiosity, that same willingness to be wrong and discover something truer. If we let go of the possibility that love can change the world, I don't know what we have left. So I get overwhelmed by these problems. They keep me up at night, and there is no pharmaceutical strong enough to knock that down. I've tried. But the only thing that brings me any kind of hope is that the same love that has moved me will be part of what moves the needle on some of these things. But evil's in the world, and people want power and status, and they are going to walk over other people to get it. And they're going to say, God led them to do that, and here's this great reason why it's okay that these people suffer even though all these other people have this great advantage. That doesn't sound like love to me. That sounds like status. It's just so complicated. It's so complicated. So what I hope we can do is remember those seminal values that have made us who we are. Odds are, whatever your profession was or is, you got into it because you felt like that's a way you could make a difference. You became a teacher. You became a doctor. You became an administrator because you saw this is a way I can offer love and care from my giftedness that's going to make a real difference. That's a wonderful way to get started. And you'll see these other, I'm in this organization, and this group has money, and they don't know what to do with their money, but they want advice, and so I can suggest this, and we can partner with the Children's Defense Fund, and let's actually bring in teachers from schools and learn from them what they need. But when we just blame, I think we were working backwards. I feel like I'm babbling at this point, but it's so complicated. I don't have a wrapped up, beautifully presented answer. The only thing I know to do is go back to who God says God is and what God has asked us to be a part of, which is, Jesus put it very succinctly, love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And for me, that's learning, is loving God with our minds. And love your neighbor as yourself. Not love your neighbor as lucky to be near you. Love your neighbor as yourself. We love to blame a victim, don't we? Mm-hmm.
And we've got to be willing to listen and open up.
We all have biases. And even those rooted in experience doesn't mean they are universally true. One of the hardest ways I'm still figuring out how to lean in on this is when people around me make inappropriate comments based on race or gender or sexuality. What can I say in that moment to challenge it? Because if I say nothing, I'm saying that's fine to joke like that, and it's not. Someone's also revealing their hand. This is really what they think, and their actions and their dollars spent are going to align with that. So it is so uncomfortable, but that pales in the comparison to the lives that are on the line. And I'm learning how, I'm still trying to figure out how do I challenge it in a way that invites more conversation. Because I can certainly shut it down and make everyone leave the table. Learn how to do that. But that's not making any change. So I've declared all kinds of things, but I haven't connected with anybody. And there'll be some people you can connect and you can go several steps in that first conversation. And some people you can get one little toe in. And you're going to have to wait until the next conversation to try to put the rest of that one toe in. This is where being Baptist is really helpful. The Holy Spirit is a kind of a guide. Glennon Doyle would call it knowing. But there's there's an intuition about that. Call it love, call it faith. That's a moment that's really hard, but I think we have access to places where those words could make a difference if we would take that opportunity. And certainly keep giving money to things, because we need money to resource these ideas. But there are people who might be open to talking with you about the complexities of these issues and broadening their biases about them that wouldn't with someone else. And so you have a unique opportunity there to make a difference. And it might feel small, one conversation, but that's that exposure. That's that transformative exposure. You don't know what God can do with that seed.
Courtney, I'm thinking of too about, and I had a preview of the images that you had for us today, which we were looking at as you were unpacking Faithia's story and preaching a fine sermon. But I wonder if you
Do you want to go back? Yeah.
You could tell people, because there's some intentionality with the historical and the current images.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody might have caught that.
You want to drive?
You tell me where you want to.
Yeah, that's the first one, I think. So this right here, I'll just take that with me. Is that okay? Can I take it? Okay. So this is Selma, 1965. This is Charlottesville, 2017. That is the Drag for All Ages protest at the Pink Palace. And that is a potential overturning of Roe protest in the street. And you'll notice, I thought the parallel was really striking for me, particularly with these clergy who, you probably recognize Cornel West right there, but clergy of all different traditions who say, these are not issues we can ignore. So it is not okay that a bunch of white supremacist men showed up with tiki torches and invoked language of Hitler about white supremacy. That is a moment where proclamation has to happen, and clergy need to be at the front of that line. The front of the line is dangerous. People get killed. But that's where freedom faith happens. To say, I am going to trust God to take me there, and I'm going to trust God to bring me back. And in the movement, you remember James Reeb was a clergy in Selma who was killed for his connection. And then the next slide, I couldn't stop thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer and Lyndon B. Johnson when Stacey Abrams ran against Brian Kemp. The way there was the intentional undermining and trying to neglect everything those women were saying because of the body from which it came. And so I put those there to invite us to consider them in parallel, 50 years apart, 60 years apart, but the same. And then this is from a reunion of Selma talking about still fighting for rights to vote, as if abortion is the right to vote for what happens to my own body, and I still don't have that right. You may not know, I chair the clergy board for Planned Parenthood Tennessee and Mississippi, and so we work a lot with health advocates and local clergy to support public education about what abortion is and isn't, and not that it's anybody's business, but why someone might choose to have one, the kind of difference it can make economically for someone to have the future they choose, and that we're not going to blame women for getting pregnant because everybody has sex. Probably all of you have had it. I have 2 kids, so that cat's out of the bag. That's just part of being human, right? It's that desire to connect, and we're not going to villainize it. Okay, the next one. These 2 are Birmingham. You've got a police encouraging a dog to attack a young man, and then these are high-pressure water hoses, literally knocking people over, compared to Dakota Access Pipeline. This was in the spring in Birmingham, so it was not warm, but not freezing cold. It was freezing cold when they sprayed protesters with water at Dakota Pipeline, and it was to get them to leave. They sprayed water on them in freezing temperatures. But these images are, even the way the people are in this frame is almost identical. And then this is from a Black Lives Matter protest. I think that was Baltimore. But again, she's in an evening gown, completely unarmed, and police have riot gear just to talk to her. If only they knew the truth she could tell. No riot guard would hold it back. Next one. Selma at the top and the bottom. That's from Portland. And this is from a George Floyd protest. But again, this isn't love. This is law and order. It's to get people to conform, to keep white people comfortable. But probably a lot of the truth that needs to be said is going to make white people uncomfortable, and it needs to happen. Comfort is just not God's concern. Safety, security, but not comfort. And if you need a way to say that to white people, remind them about the Chronicles of Narnia, when the beaver asks, or is Aslan safe? Of course he's not safe, but he's good. That's another, you can find cultural images that they trust, and then they become more open.
And this is not an original thought, but one of the things that's helpful, I think, about the juxtaposition that you've given us of these images is this sense of like, I can tell myself a nice story about what I would have done in the 60s, and then I can look at my calendar for what I'm doing today,
Mhm.
and those don't, the story the imagination that I have about myself and my daily life are not the same. And so I think that's one of the things that's helpful about this, like, oh, if I had lived in Nazi Germany, I would have, blah, blah, blah. Well, actually, speaking of comfort, actually that makes me a little uncomfortable,
Yeah.
So I think and really the visual parallels and similarities between these past stories where we've neatened up the edges.
Mm-hmm.
And today, I'm like, well, it'd be really comfortable. What would happen to me? What will happen to me this week when they release the footage? Where will I be?
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate your unpacking those a little bit for us. And
Thank you. This is me trying to bring millennialism into the study of history. I think it's really helpful. So I really appreciate that you said that. You probably have heard a lot of people talk about how supportive they were of the movement when it happened. There were so few churches that would let mass meetings meet there because churches got burned down. People went missing. There was a real cost, and a lot of people were scared. And it's okay to be scared. Not all of us are made for the front line of the march, but we are called to be faithful with what we have where we are. And I think a good way to tell if someone is as supportive as they were, so the way SNCC was then is kind of the way Black Lives Matter is now. It's edgy, it's not something easily controlled, but it's out there doing long-term work in communities trying to make a difference. I think that's a really important parallel. Or some of us will say, well, I'm okay with people being gay, but I don't understand transgenderism, or I don't understand drag shows. Do you need to? Why is that the gateway? If someone says, this is how I feel most myself, then it seems the only reaction would be, congratulations. How can I affirm you as you understand yourself to be? Because trying to make people fit a social construct is killing people. Because they can't walk in a room as their whole self. They can't go home as their whole self. And we can't control what happens at home, but it's up to us what happens here. And Jesus said, don't invite the pretty people to the party. Set a big table and invite everyone outside. Because that's where community is. If you look at historically the churches that have tithed the most, dollar amount and percentage of income, it's lower income congregations, because they understand we need each other. And so they give, because someday they're going to need, and they're going to show up for other people. And it seems so trite, but it's just people living according to love. Just forget the hierarchy. Think in circles. We're not going to think in triangles, we're going to think in circles. I am because you are, and you are because I am. My freedom is tied up in your freedom. If you don't have access to health care you can afford, I'm in that with you. And when we take that connection out, that's privilege, and that's what we're all going to have it. You're not a terrible person for being human, and you grew up white in Memphis, and we can't change that. But once you are aware, get rid of, purge it, and replace it with something truer. I mean, isn't that the whole point of Christian life, is we all are where we are, and we just constantly renew ourselves as we discover things that are truer than what we held? That's the life of justice. We're just seeking truth, seeking love.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Courtney for her wisdom and her passion. And I also want to tell you a little bit about what's coming up, because I never miss the chance for that. Next Sunday, we will gather in a slightly different way. It's the annual meeting Sunday, and we're going to hear a little bit about where Calvary has been in the past year and where we're headed, and it's going to be a really exciting, powerful conversation to be a part of, so I hope you'll be here for that. And then we're going to return for a couple Sundays to this same theme played out in some different ways. It's interesting that you just mentioned C.S. Lewis. We're going to have a couple of conversations about these historical figures, much like Prathia Hall, and then bringing them and connecting them with our stories today. So early in February, we're going to hear from a C.S. Lewis scholar about the power of imagination. And then we're going to hear from our own Tim Hubner about Lincoln's story and Lincoln's faith on Lincoln's birthday, just maybe on purpose. You know, sometimes we know what we're doing around here. But looking back at these historical figures and people, and then looking very carefully at today and our own lives, and so that there's some threading through those conversations. And then all of this is just, as part of one long extended conversation about how we're formed and shaped and how we learn from where we have been and where we're going. And one of the places that we're going is launching into the season of Lent, when we'll invite this beautiful list of preachers to come and talk to us about the future of faith. And so it's going to be some great conversations throughout the second half of the winter and into the spring around here. And I'm excited to be on that journey with you. So thank you all for being here this morning. Courtney may stick around for just a minute for those who want to check in and say hello, but I know you've got worship to get to. So thanks be to God for this gathering. Go in peace. Love and serve the Lord.